So in preparing for my remarks for this program, I considered the chair's coverage of this issue of anti-Semitism over the years. These stubborn truths, the truths about anti-Semitism and its harms, have not abated, unfortunately. Undoubtedly, anti-Semitism falls under our attempt to view the ways in which prejudice stops us from achieving a more peaceful world. But perhaps anti-Semitism is not only a form of prejudice. Perhaps it is something darker, deeper, something touching human nature and the state of our soul. What are we to do? How do we adjust to its constant shape-shifting, its reintroduction under ever new but eternally false guiles and premises? What does it mean to be an ethical individual in an age of unenlightened anti-Semitism? One motivated and sped forth by technologies and new and old arguments. Today, our distinguished speaker, Professor Susannah Heschel, will help us to address these issues. Her work reminds us that the ongoing battle to eradicate prejudice and anti-Semitism is an essential undertaking for every single one of us. So it's really my pleasure to introduce her to you. Professor Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on the history of Jewish and Protestant religious thought in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, and she has brought post-colonial theory and feminist theory to her analysis. She is the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany, Jewish Islam, Islam and German Jewish Self-Understanding, as well as several edited volumes, including Insider, Outsider, American Jews and Multiculturalism and Betrayal, German Churches and the Holocaust. Forthcoming are a monograph written with Sarah Imhoff, Jewish Studies and the Woman Question, and a co-edited volume, New Paths, Essays in Honor of Professor Elliot Wolfson, with Glenn Diner and Shaul Magid. Professor Heschel is the recipient of 5 honorary doctorates. She has held fellowships from Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and year-long fellowships at the National Humanities Center and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin. In 2013, she became a Guggenheim Fellow. We are honored to have her with us today. The title of her talk is The Tenacity of Antisemitism from Global to the Emotional. Please welcome Professor Heschel.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Hoda Mahmoudi for inviting me to speak and for your very gracious introduction. It's wonderful to be here at the University of Maryland once again and to be with colleagues and friends, and especially with Professor Jeffrey Herf from the History Department, who is, as I'm sure you all know, the preeminent scholar of anti-Semitism in Europe. I'm going to talk to you today about some aspects of anti-Semitism that I feel deserve some additional attention from us. I'm interested in particular in the tenacity of anti-Semitism, and I ask myself what makes it tenacious. That is, what do anti-Semites derive as some sort of satisfaction from being anti-Semitic? I draw in my analysis a bit from some of the scholars who've worked on racism in America. I'm interested also in the chameleon quality of anti-Semitism, as Professor Mahmoudi mentioned, that it is able to have a global reach and change its nature in so many different circumstances and different religious settings and theological systems and social and political movements from right wing to left wing. I'm also interested in its ideological nature, and in particular, the problem of falsifiability. As you remember from Karl Popper's work, a scientific experiment is is not legitimate or valid if it cannot be falsified. It's falsifiability rather than verifiability that makes something scientific. And the problem, of course, of anti-Semitism is that it doesn't have falsifiability, as we've just seen in the past week with the statements made by Kanye West, who was then canceled from certain contracts and then was able to use, he and his 31 million followers on Twitter, use those cancellations to demonstrate the so-called truth of his claims in the first place. So the circular reasoning, the absence of the possibility of falsifiability is what, of course, gives the strength and tenacity to anti-Semitism. But those are some of the things I want to talk about. Another is also the way certain anti-Semitic ideas are presented with probability. So, for example, in my own research on anti-Semitism in the Nazi period among certain theologians who claimed that Jesus was not a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan, often they'll claim with the greatest probability or most likely Jesus was an Aryan, Jesus was a German, Jesus was born in Schleswig-Holstein and not in Palestine. And the probable, of course, is for the sake of the reader, the recipient, who will then say, oh, probable. Well, I want to be a reasonable person, don't I? So I can accept a probability. In other words, it's sometimes propaganda can be more effective with certain recipients if it's presented not as a hard and fast argument, but a probability. Wouldn't you agree with me? Isn't it possible? Let's reason together and so forth. That's some propaganda. Obviously, it's not how it always works. And then I'm also interested in the question of scholarship and the scholarly endeavor to examine anti-Semitism. I'll say a word about my own, but I also have to ask what it is about the nature of anti-Semitism that makes so many people shy away from the topic, even scholars who are very deeply concerned with problems of racism, problems of sexism, with problems that exist around the world that we want to analyze. I wonder sometimes if women's studies scholars would ever think to disparage women, even those who oppose feminism, the way so many scholars in the field of Jewish studies ignore anti-Semitism or somehow come up with an explanation that blames Jews for anti-Semitic moments and occurrences. I think that the problems that face us, the ethical challenges that face us as scholars, are heightened when we examine not only what is written about anti-Semitism, but what is not written about anti-Semitism. I'll just mention, how did I come to this topic? I am an engaged Jew. I am the child of a father who fled Warsaw at the very last minute by great good fortune. I'm a Zionist. I'm a scholar of German Jewish history, and I read the newspapers. Now, I know that this talk is part of a series of lectures that the Baha'i Center has sponsored, Baha'i Center for World Peace, which I think is something very special that you have here at this university, for world peace, yes. You've heard from other scholars, and I hope that I will not be too repetitive from the other lectures. I think what I would like to do is to focus perhaps a bit less on the many statements made about Jews, the many images of Jews. I will talk about some. Those have flourished from antiquity to the present around the world. They're pointed against individual Jews, against pious as well as secular, against groups of Jews, against Jews who try to fight back, whether through the legal system, through political work, through interreligious dialogue, even the effort by Jews to leave anti-Semitic parts of the world and not exist in certain areas doesn't necessarily bring the anti-Semitism of the region to a close, but especially Jews who have recognized on the basis of the anti-Semitism that it is necessary to establish our own separate state. Rescuing Jews from anti-Semitism without sovereignty, without military or safe haven is simply not possible, and that quite clearly is one of the foundations, one of foundational reasons and founding reasons for the state of Israel, and I'll come back to that. But I want to talk today about some methodological questions, some additional ways of thinking about aspects of both anti-Semitism and its impact on Jews. So I'm especially concerned, as I said, with the tenacity of anti-Semitism, with the chameleon quality of anti-Semitism to insert itself into ideological systems that otherwise are in conflict, right-wing and left-wing, for example. I'm interested also in the sensory and emotional impact of anti-Semitism on Jews and on Jewish scholars, drawing from the work of Saidia Hartman, among others, who do emphasize issues of trauma. I think we also need to think about the trauma of anti-Semitism. Given its longevity, I want to emphasize that anti-Semitism seems to offer a perverse and dangerous emotional and religious gratification to anti-Semites that we should be aware of. The trauma is for Jews, and this kind of gratification of anti-Semites, something that we need to think about. Finally, I want to emphasize the danger that anti-Semitism functions in this way as this closed system, self-justifying, lacking falsifiability. That seems to me over and over again so dangerous, and shockingly so that it is in this day and time. Now, the ability of anti-Semitism to be so tenacious, to elude destruction. What are the strategies of anti-Semitic propaganda? The emotional appeal of anti-Semitism, from medieval Christian rhetoric to Hitler's Mein Kampf to the internet. The expansiveness of anti-Semitism to include people from so many different groups, Asians, trans, LGBTQ, feminists, leftists, right-wing, make its danger relevant to all of us, especially now in an era of democratic fragility. Jews are demonized as a group and as individuals, and that then is shifted to the state of Israel. Israel is blamed by many on the left for introducing political tensions into the Middle East, and in that case, it completely ignoring Sunni Shiite conflicts or ethnic conflicts within Syria, the many ethnic conflicts, thanks to the many ethnic groups within Islam, and the alliances of Arab countries with leaders such as Putin, for example, or other dictators establishing totalitarian regimes for their Arab populations. Israel is the enemy when Sisi is imprisoning political prisoners, people who were speaking out. I just met someone from Cairo the other day who is a refugee in the United States from that system. Attacks on Israel, of course, divert attention from some of the complexities. They simplify and give us quick little answers. But again, they're frequently false, and they're especially pernicious because they use anti-Semitic stereotypes against Jews and apply them to Israel. So for example, portraying Israel as murdering and even eating children, much as Jews were accused of ritual murder of Christian children in order to supposedly use their blood to bake matzah, an accusation that began in the 12th century and has continued to the present, again with a global reach. And yet, despite this, too many scholars on the left, particularly theorists writing on racism, pay little or no attention to anti-Semitism. And this is particularly troubling because of the clear connections demonstrated by scholars of racism. And I'll just mention one of many, Jake Cameron Carter, in his book, Race, a Theological Account, that Christian supersessionism, its negation of Judaism, established a pattern of thinking that created the global idea of race in the first place. That racism, in other words, emerges from Christian theology, specifically from Christianity's effort to legitimate itself by rejecting Judaism, an effort that soon created whiteness and race as ideas. So to think about racism and not think about anti-Semitism strikes me as academically unacceptable. I want to just mention, and there's so much to say about early Christianity and its understanding of Judaism, the place and the legacy of that understanding. I want to mention just one aspect, one of the most important, and that comes from Augustine. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 led to charges that it was the fault of the Christians, that the gods had turned against Rome because it had forsaken pagan civilization. Augustine wrote his City of God in response to those charges. The book is a theology of human history from the creation of the world to the end of days. Augustine formulated an understanding of Jews playing a role that ruled Christian thought for centuries. He argued that God had preserved the Jews so that they, in turn, might preserve the Holy Bible, from which Christians learn their own faith. But the Jews themselves, and this is the crucial element, do not understand their own Bible. They are, and this is Augustine's point, the metaphor, Jews are like a blind person looking into a mirror. Nonetheless, based on Romans 2:28 and a few other verses, Augustine insisted that Christians ought to preserve the Jews, but in a miserable, subservient position to serve as witnesses to Christian truth. This important Augustinian doctrine of Jewish witness was crucial in keeping Jews from being murdered, but also crucial in keeping Jews from rising above a lowly social status. This reigned for a long time in the West, and elements of this image, especially like a blind person looking into a mirror, survived many of the transition points when Christianity was abandoned and a secular realm entered the world. But the overriding point that I want to emphasize is that anti-Semitism has a life of its own, even when Jews are not present. The Augustinian doctrine prevailed wherever Christians were located, but even when Jews were not present. And so we can find hatred, fear, and contempt for Jews in parts of Asia, or for instance, in Franco's translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion during the Spanish Civil War, despite the fact that neither Asia nor Spain had Jews present. How do we understand this? Anti-Semitism is its own tool of power. It's a weapon of lethal danger to Jews, but also poses danger to non-Jews. Anti-Semitism accommodates itself to national interests because it's an all-purpose weapon. Anti-Semitism can function, for instance, to bring an end to American democracy. And that's why anti-Semitism is of concern to all human beings. But there are troubling ways in which this history of anti-Semitism has been interpreted. So as an example, you may remember previous generation, the British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who argued that, quote, if there has been such a long history of anti-Semitism, perhaps there is something Jews have done to provoke it, end quote. On the left, anti-Semitism presents itself not as a prejudice, but as a retaliation for the oppressed. Attacks and even murders of Jews in Europe are presented as payback for Israel's occupation of the West Bank. I remember the attack on the synagogue in Vienna in 1981 and how the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, responded to that at the time. We might consider this kind of anti-Semitism irrational, but it presents with its own logic. So I think everybody feels more comfortable when we have an explanation when something terrible happens. Well, if I hadn't done this, it wouldn't have happened. All right, I understand that. But sometimes the explanation goes like this. Why were 6 million Jews murdered? An Egyptian weekly, October, wrote in 1989, quote, "It has now become clear that perhaps Hitler did have justification for gassing the Jews, because if the Jews were allowed freedom of action, they would have eaten others," end quote. Note the reference to Jews as cannibals, placing Jews outside the scope of the ethical, even outside the scope of the human. Jews are a demonic danger. Such so-called explanations are offered for other disasters, September 11th, or illegal drugs. Jews are not only invoked to explain disasters, Jews are actually functioning here in this anti-Semitic literature as an outlet for passions. Symbols speak very loudly, painting swastikas on Jewish tombstones in cemeteries or in synagogues or Jewish school buildings. The symbol, the swastika, conveys instant contempt, degradation, and horror to Jews and non-Jews, while the perpetrators feel they've done something strong and powerful. Look what I've done. Within the US, a variety of social movements have been called Jewish, including the Civil Rights Movement, feminism as a quote, a Judaic conspiracy against the white race, end quote. The US Congress has been called the ZOG, meaning the Zionist Occupational Government. Israel is called apartheid, but Turkey is not. Israel is called fascist, but Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are not. We pay more attention in the UN to Israel and in our newspapers than we do to Myanmar, with its ongoing genocide against Muslim Rohingya, or to the horrific war in Yemen, or the civil war in Ethiopia, or the totalitarian regime in Belarus, and I can go on. Stabbing, shooting, or killing with a car while shouting, Allahu Akbar, the targets may be random, Jews, Christians, seculars. In some cases, the killers hunt for Jews to murder, as in the Jewish school in Toulouse, France, or the Chabad house in Mumbai, or the synagogues in Oslo, Stockholm, Halle, Copenhagen, Vienna, Tunisia, Istanbul, Pittsburgh, Poway, just to name a few, or the Jewish museums in Brussels and Jerba, or the Jewish Community Center in Kansas, or the kosher supermarket in Paris, or the elderly Holocaust survivor who was tortured and murdered in her apartment in a Paris suburb by a neighbor, a Muslim neighbor, or the Jewish children shot dead outside their school in France. Attacks at Christmas markets in Berlin and Strasbourg, or on the boardwalk in Nice, or the Bataclan Theater in Paris. These are also assaults on European society. Why? Because they are societies in which Jews are free to live as equal citizens. Anti-Semitic attacks are attacks on all of us. Drawing from the theories of queer temporalities, I want to suggest that we think about anti-Semitism as never limited or enclosed by a particular moment or by one singular ideological trajectory. I would rather suggest that anti-Semitism is better conceptualized as a reservoir of possibility waiting to be activated by the present. In the unconscious, time is not linear. And there, anti-Semitism lives in a nest of fantasies, just waiting to be activated. Myths, images, and ideas of the past can erupt in the present. And Nietzsche's genealogical analysis of ruptures and eruptions, more than lines of continuity, help us understand how anti-Semitism works in a burst. Anti-Semites are experienced by their victims as revivifications of the past. In the realm of the imagination, the present is experienced as a revival of the past. So we can understand, for example, in The Merchant of Venice, Shylock's insistence on his bond, resurrecting Christian fantasies of Jews as carnal, legalistic, lacking mercy. They are brought up and erupt. Only rarely are the language and images of anti-Semitism something new and original. Rather, they recreate what has already been articulated in the past, revivifying hostility. And so the increasing disinterest in the field of history contributes to the political danger of anti-Semitism. Now I want to turn for a moment to Christopher Browning's important book, Ordinary Men, about the groups of mobile killing units. And I have to tell you that I returned one week ago. I returned from a week in Eastern Poland, and I visited many of the villages and towns where these mobile killing units, Einsatzgruppen, went through and murdered Jews, wiped them out. It reminded me of the neutron bomb that murders human beings and leaves the building standing. Jews were wiped out, the flourishing civilization, millions of Jews. In the book by Browning, which is a book I strongly urge everyone to read, these people whom he calls ordinary men, they were civilian police officers brought to Poland to murder people, human beings. But in the book, when they describe what they were doing day to day, they didn't rant against Jews. Franz Stangl, in the wonderful book by Gitta Sereny, Into the Darkness, an excellent book. Franz Stangl, who was commandant of Treblinka for Sobibor, then Treblinka, who was ultimately convicted of the murder of 900,000 Jews, was not a ranting, raving anti-Semite. And in fact, in most of these cases, and we take it with a grain of salt, they denied anti-Semitism as their motive. That denial is disingenuous. If anything, it indicates to me that that the anti-Semitism is saying the Jews are not even worthy of being hated. It's anti-Semitism in a different register. Secret, silent anti-Semitism has its own power. It's not rowdy and enthusiastic and loud. It's seductively quiet and self-possessed, aloof, cultivating an air of mystery, and yet easily genocidal. Nazi anti-Semitism was loud and vociferous, not silent. And yet silence about anti-Semitism's role in Nazi Germany continues in some historical scholarship. Even when subtle rhetoric can have a murderous impact, it's because language possesses not only the words, but also an affect, an emotional impact that is often long-lasting. I think for a moment of the thousands of Black Americans who were tortured and lynched by white men and women, often right after Sunday church services. There were no political rallies or racist rants in a church that led these white men and women to capture, torture, and murder a Black man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a child. And yet such violence could occur right after gospel readings and hymn singing and a sermon. Did whites consider lynching Black people a response to Christian worship? Christian religious services were also held in Nazi concentration camps led by pastors and priests for the SS who were killing Jews. Presumably nothing was spoken explicitly at these religious services, whether about Blacks in church or something against Jews that would encourage murder. No. Motivations, in other words, need not be verbalized, so they may elude sometimes empiricist historians. We might instead consider anti-Semitic and racist motivation aroused in a different emotional register. What do I mean? Even without saying something anti-Semitic or racist, perhaps attending a religious service affirms a sense of moral self-righteousness that overrides ethical inhibition, social convention, and even laws against murder, and generates a sense of social cohesion in the religious service. Even if racist rants were absent from the church service, lynching was no less a racist act, and the murder of Jews by these mobile killing units, these Einsatzgruppen, was no less anti-Semitic if the murderers claimed they were simply following orders. Rhetoric does not require verbal articulation in the moment, but it can be revivified as unspoken passions demanding fulfillment. What makes anti-Semitism so appealing and tenacious? Conventional correlations of finances, social status, educational level with racist beliefs fail to explain the ability of anti-Semitism to override issues of personal relevance, such as jobs, healthcare, education. Understand, in Nazi Germany, they were getting rid of a professional class of university professors, doctors, lawyers. People need those. This leads to a different register. The tenacity of anti-Semitism makes us wonder what deeper gratifications it offers, and at what intimate level it has hitched itself to our minds. Anti-Semitism arises at times because Jews are other, but at other times because Jews are felt too intimately, as evidenced when anti-Semitic violence exploded against neighbors in a pogrom, or in the spontaneous murder of the Jews in the village of Jedwabne, Poland. Medieval Christian hostility was not directed toward a distant religion, but toward Judaism, the foundation of Christianity, the religion of Jesus and of Paul. There are no two religions that stand in such an intimate relationship. Well, intimacy, we usually think intimacy at times generates empathy, but it may also enhance sadistic gratification. So the erotics of race and the erotics of terror that the scholar Saidiya Hartman has spoken about in her analyses of enslavement in the United States points to the pleasure acquired by the sadism of racist denigration. A sadism that comes with a feeling of transgression and excitement that seem to overcome, at least temporarily, self-denigration. Anti-Semitic ideology is seductive, all the more so when anti-Semitism spreads. We are more likely to find anti-Semitism appealing when it is widespread in a society. In its seductive way, anti-Semitism presents itself as offering answers to our questions, revealing some hidden knowledge about Jews, especially of conspiracy, a strategy that functions to gratify our concerns and questions and give us a sense of superiority to the anti-Semite. To promote anti-Semitism feels as though we've joined a special club or lifted ourselves to a more sophisticated level, perhaps. Now, Afro-pessimists such as Frank Wilderson and Tenacity Heschel argue that Blacks are viewed in the white mind as non-life. And so when Black police kill Black men, when policemen kill Black men, they don't think of it as murder because they don't think Black people are actually alive. Afro-pessimism explains the ongoing racial fantasies of Black criminality, supposedly, and parasitism. Blackness is created as the non-human, non-life. Anti-Semites also view Jews as parasites, but locate Jewish criminality not as non-life, but Jews are the power that brings death. Whereas modern capitalism created itself through the enslavement of Black flesh, modern secularism, which is, after all, as Talal Asad argues, Christianity in a new form, modern secularism turned Jews into racialized, life-threatening carnality that has to be annihilated. Jews not only kill the spirit of religion, as St. Paul wrote, Jews killed God himself in Christ. And so when Achille Mbembe writes that the state of Israel is the greatest necropower in the world, he is speaking as a Christian theologian in secularized terms, Jews as the sign of death. But these are not simply whispered, secretive statements. One of the important elements of anti-Semitism is its public performance. That would include theater pieces such as The Merchant of Venice, representations of Jews in wood carvings or paintings in European churches in particular, of a Jew murdering a Christian child or a Jew riding a pig backward that still exist in the churches all over Europe. The new mode we have is the internet. Social media are not only vehicles to communicate racism and anti-Semitism, they are also media for performing anti-Semitism in a public space. What is performance? Performance is neo-Nazis marching and chanting, "Jews will not replace us," calling out "Sieg Trump," and wearing tattoos of the number 88, which is code for Heil Hitler. But posting a tweet is also a way to display oneself, especially if you have 31 million recipients of the tweet. It's a way to create a personality, to become an influencer. The rapidity with which the internet spreads ideas comes as a shock, and so does its worldwide reach. Just as an example of the performativity, there's a journalist named Eli Saslow who described a Stormfront leader Don Black, at live gatherings of his followers performing with a costume, a cowboy hat. He has a cane because he had suffered a stroke, but he presents himself as a heroic figure to his neo-Nazi followers, and he cultivates this image. It's alt-right drama. It's intimidating. But what happens online when the cowboy hat disappears and no one knows that he's tall and imposing? The internet still offers perhaps a little different kind of performance. It's a peculiar sort of anonymity and yet presence. Presence that comes by being more radical, more outrageous, and in that way more memorable. Tweets aren't simply a way of saying something, they are a way of performing oneself. Performance, of course, also has to do with the reception of the performance. And I want to turn here to the question of sound and the role of sound in anti-Semitism. Is everybody okay if I'm going to keep going a little longer? Yes? Are you okay? Right. So I want us to think about anti-Semitism as a soundscape. The sensory experience, including sound. Emotions are sensory experience. We think about opera, for instance, that bring music together with text. We listen, we hear, and we are affected by music. We may be moved by music, maybe outraged, bored, annoyed. Opera can be physical in its impact on us. We react physically, emotionally. As Christina von Braun asks, how does an idea become transformed into the corporeal? In the notorious anti-Semitic text by Otto Weininger, published in 1903, Sex and Character, she finds a transfer of an idea of Jewishness into Jewish corporeality, while at the same time turning Jewishness into a psychological trait. I found something similar, what I called incarnational theology, in some of the Nazi literature I was reading by theologians, starting already in the late 19th century. That is, Jewishness was something that was a spiritual degradation, a moral degradation that affected all of society and posed a danger. This was a spiritual degeneracy incarnate in the Jewish body. It couldn't be separated from it. The only way to get rid of it was to get rid of the body. But it posed a danger, a threat, a deathly threat, in fact, a threat that would disintegrate the social fabric and the moral fabric. As a scholar of both gender theory and anti-Semitism, Christina von Braun, a fine scholar in Germany, emphasizes the role of erotic fantasy in anti-Semitic discourse that turns the Jews sometimes into a female sacrificial figure, other times into a sexually abnormal, voracious, destructive male figure. All the realms of possibility are open. The musicologist Ruth Hacoin from Hebrew University has traced the juxtaposition between Christian musical harmony and claims by the Christian world that Jews only produce noise, not music. Churches were viewed as places of beautiful music, synagogues as places of ugly clamor. If Christians appreciate beautiful sounds, Jews can neither produce nor appreciate musical instruments and the voices that are tools of divine worship in the church. No, they just make noise. Jews are allegedly impervious to the aesthetics of sound. They are subjected instead to the horrors of sound in their synagogues. I want to think about sound in other ways as well, about a pogrom, that is an attack against human beings, an attack against property, and also a theater of horrific sounds. We have to think about the sensory impact of pogroms, what is captured by bodily senses, seen, heard, tasted, smell, that have a long-term impact on those who suffered. Numerous Jewish testimonies, diaries, and memoirs describe the chaotic horror created by the violence of a pogrom. But let's consider the sounds. Both attackers and Jewish victims heard people's screams, property shattered, glass broken, screams of fear, horror, pain, and death. Were those sounds sadistically gratifying to the attackers? For Jews, listening to the sounds of friends, family, and neighbors being beaten, tortured, raped, and murdered, and property smashed and set on fire, a pogrom was a horrific physical and emotional experience of sound as well as physical violence. And such sounds are never forgotten, the sound of someone in pain. Nor are other sensory experiences, of course, the smell of blood, the sight of destruction, the taste of death. The soundscape of a pogrom can be as powerful as the words. A pogrom does not disseminate ideas or produce an ideology, and its impact lies well beyond the monetary value of the physical destruction, the injuries of human beings, the number of people killed. Antisemitism is not communicated by words alone. Sound is another of its vehicles. But in this, I want to also call attention to rape in pogroms. The historian Irina Ostashkevich has concluded in her dissertation that, quote, the mass rape of Jewish women occurred in at least 2/3 of pogroms and often involved the majority of the female population in the victimized community. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jewish women were victims of sexual violence, and many more Jewish men and women witnessed it, end quote. The evidence includes women's own accounts, investigations by journalists and writers in the aftermath, especially of the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. Women, some pregnant, some young children, wrote and dictated reports of being assaulted in horrific ways, often multiple times by many men, including neighbors. In the aftermath, some were shamed, some were rejected by their husbands and families, sometimes with male rabbinical approval, which reinforced the goal of mass rape, the destruction of the community. But there's more to it. Some women became pregnant. The children born of rape were sometimes abandoned. Some women died by suicide. Some died from the rape itself, from injuries. The consequences last generations. However, a recent study of pogroms during the Russian Civil War includes this statement. In addition, thousands of women were raped, period, and nothing more. Another historian asserts, without citing evidence, that, quote, while rapes undoubtedly did occur, they were not a widespread phenomenon. In particular, they were not accompanied by murder and mutilation, end quote. In a recent study of emotions among pogrom perpetrators, the word rape does not even appear. But I want us to think in broader terms about the impact of rape and pogroms. Rape mutilates women's lives in every imaginable way and affects the lives of their families, including men as well, because rape is a sexualized tool of political violence. Precisely the body part with which women express love is now subjected to horrific violence. Rape tells a woman your body does not belong to you. Rape has been called the essence of unfreedom. Internally, the consequences of the brutality include death, disease, painful and permanent deformities, infertility, incontinence, constant pain. And the emotional consequences of rape shatter a woman's sense of self. History is what hurts, writes Frederick Jameson, and historians need to be attentive to that hurt. But there's more to it than that. Pogroms are violent riots with multiple aims: rampant, uncontrolled destruction and looting property, beating, raping, killing without compunction, and they function as public theater, spectacles whose desire is to humiliate and degrade. Economic tensions, it might be a spark, but the destructiveness did not enrich the perpetrators. Most striking is pogrom intimacy, violence directed against neighbors and friends. For instance, a Jewish woman who testified she was raped by a Christian man whom she had cradled as an infant. But I think there is an additional dimension. Assaulting women with rape is what we might call religiocide, an attack to destroy the religion of Judaism. Like most religions, Judaism's gender binary and laws regarding sexuality and purity are foundational, starting with the Bible and the Talmud. Rabbinic law, the Talmud, discusses the vagina more than any other body part. And it has meticulous regulations concerning heterosexual intercourse. Violating the laws of menstrual impurity is punished by being banned from heaven after death. So mass rape assaults of women are also attacks on Judaism, on its purity codes, its codes of gender and sexuality, the very heart of every religion. Pogrom rapists knew they were polluting Judaism. Quote, "It seems like you haven't slept with a Gentile yet. Now you will know the taste of one," end quote. Mass perpetrator rape, especially in the context of widespread violence, is multi-genocidal. It targets women, families, and communities, and it targets religion itself. It is religiocidal. The Marquis de Sade presented debauchery in a church as the greatest sexual pleasure. Mass rape and a pogrom enacted the scene, defiling Judaism by raping women. And so I say this to urge historians to take that element more seriously and to keep in mind that when in Charlottesville, Nazis were marching saying, "The Jews will not replace us," in the local synagogue, Jews were huddled, hoping the police would come and escort them out, but the police told them they were too busy. That is the verge, the edge of a pogrom. Not yet a pogrom, the edge. So let's think about pogroms more seriously. In conclusion, during the first decades after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism itself became a taboo. And the shame that anti-Semites imposed on Jews was transferred to anti-Semites themselves. You should be ashamed for being an anti-Semite. Just as anti-Semites had described Jews as a disease, as a virus that spreads, anti-Semitism was now described using similar imagery and terminology. Non-Jews were now told to be ashamed of anti-Semitic teachings and the consequences, the Holocaust. And yet, it seems to me, shame is an incendiary emotion, one that is not easily tolerated and can generate dangerous rage and revenge, as we see today. On the left, non-Jews and anti-Semites are now rejecting shame, and conservatives on the right demand that Jews either return to the status of the shamed or join the Christian world in becoming the shamers of others, that is, a self-elevation through the debilitation of others, gaining the control of biopolitics through authoritarian regimes. Demagogues are successful in engineering shame so that hatred of others becomes a source of pride. Passions, once aroused, however, cannot easily be quashed, and they can be rerouted. So enslavement became illegal in the United States, but the sadism that drove it continued to demand gratification. Today's growing authoritarian racist governments and political movements foster fascination with Nazism and are growing within democratic countries along with anti-Semitism. We have religious teachings that insist on the immorality of racism. We have laws that restrict and punish sadistic actions. We have education that defines goals and strategies, and museums that show us the horrors of where it can lead. But overcoming the sadism that desires anti-Semitism eludes those methods. The sadistic gratification that gives anti-Semitism its power requires a complex redress, a redirection of the sensory experience to find gratification through non-sadistic pleasures, if that is possible. But a final word about scholars. Saidia Hartman notes that for African Americans, even after enslavement became illegal, the trauma of violence, degradation, and abjection remained ensconced emotionally in the individual, fortified by Jim Crow social norms, politics, and law. She writes, quote, "The whip was not abandoned, rather it was to be internalized. For enslaved people, to be beaten was the pain of violence and the constant dread of it." In other words, we have to think about the trauma. And in that connection, also about the scholar. What are the emotional consequences of studying scenes of terror, rhetoric of hatred, threats and acts of violence and murder? Nigel Cunningham writes, "Each time I pick up Saidiya Hartman's book, Scenes of Subjection, I am made to rediscover the enduring legacies of slavery as an uncanny illumination of the present. That rediscovery is as much a remembering as it is a kind of touch, a sentient relation to an animating alterity that is retrospectively sensed, felt, and known." Studying antisemitism inevitably prompts a strong emotional response in the scholar, as when we contemplate the question, what does a pogrom sound like? The emotional impact of reading documents describing atrocities, hearing ideologues screaming hatred of Jews, and interviewing survivors and also perpetrators is not without personal consequences. I have enormous respect for colleagues such as Professor Herf, who have spent decades of their lives studying this material. I wrote one book on the Nazi period and couldn't write another. The trauma of history elicits these emotional and visceral reactions in the historian and challenges our cognitive modes of historical interpretation. The emotions creating and perpetuating antisemitism and racism ultimately haunt the lives of scholars as we struggle to understand and overcome their legacies and continued presence within our societies. And so I conclude by paying tribute to fellow scholars and to students, and hope that they will nonetheless persist. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Heschel. What a powerful but emotional lecture, and so many lessons for us to take away, especially at this time in the climate that we live in. I'd like to open it now to questions from our audience here, and we have something like over 54 people maybe online. So, pardon? Oh, 65, it's gone up, okay. So we'll entertain questions from both audiences. Yes, Malik, you wanna just give him the microphone so that the people can hear it who are online.
Thank you for your talk. That was just wonderful and really gave us a lot to think about. I want to talk about, or ask you your thoughts about the power of sort of a, I don't want to call it almost a spiritual poetics that, you know, goes back to the Hebrew Bible. And I think in some ways underscores even a lot of anti-Semitisms that show up in material ways. And I think this is a big thing in the African American community in ways that aren't always public. My family's here, my father's family's from DC, and there's a way in which, you know, that though they don't talk about it in public, there's a way in which folks sort of view gentrification as, you know, when the Babylonians came.
As what?
When the Babylonians came. And part of that is a sense of shame, because there's a sense that, you know, God gave us the land, he told us to, you know, do X, Y, and Z. We didn't do what we were supposed to, and now folks have sort of come in. And so I wonder, you talked about the probable, but this whole poetics that says, look, the people of Israel live, the God of Israel lives, friends of the people of, friends of those, will be friends of him, so and so and so and so. And it seems to me that there's a spiritual probability that says, if you look throughout history, no matter what people have tried to do, the people of Israel are still here, without framing that in a nationalistic sense or a kind of cultural pride. But I do think, so I wonder if there's a translation of that. I wonder if a translation of that is possible in sort of a secular, age. But I think this is one, that kind of spiritual poetics is one that means a lot to different groups who aren't, Jewish, but who've taken inspiration. And I think you see it sort of done wrongly in modern Christianity. But I think when it's done right, you don't really hear about it. And I think if you look at the civil rights movement, I think that sort of is there, where people are saying, look, we're going to try to do what's right. We believe that God will see us, and we believe that, the truth will out.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your question and your comments. You've said a lot, and there's a lot I could say in response, but I'll just say briefly, yes, I agree with you. The spiritual poetics of the Hebrew Bible have been very inspiring. I would say that at least in the Christian side, African-American theology, first of all, tends to focus on the Gospels, not on the Pauline epistles. And there's a reason, historical reason for that, which is that white preachers would be called in to speak to Black enslaved people and tell them you have to obey your master, as St. Paul says. And in response, as Albert Raboteau shows in his study, Black religion developed around the Gospels and not around Paul. And Jesus was viewed as a Jew. And I find that in the writings of people from Albert Clegg, Martin Luther King, James Cone, so on, Esau Macaulay, there's no denial of Jesus's Jewishness at all. There's an affirmation. And if anything, more of an identification of Jesus with Moses and with the Hebrew Bible than I find in much of white theology. And that's striking to me. So I think that is a separate and important theological tradition that should receive more attention. I would agree.
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Herf. Susannah, thank you for your comments. I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about Christianity and, if you will, also Islam, to talk about the emotional satisfaction, sense of pride, sense of righteousness that is evident in the radicalized interpretations of Christianity and Islam when they attack the Jews. And the lecture today is about something more culturally specific, located within the Western tradition of both Christianity and Islam. That emotion, that one is absolutely right, the Jews are absolutely evil, not only in Charlottesville, but in Berlin in the 1940s was shouted publicly all the time. There was nothing, the Nazi leadership was, as you know, not reticent about declaring how proud they were about killing the Jews, because the Jews were evil and they were saving the world from them. So it's this, we hear often it's so difficult to talk about race. I'm not really convinced of that. I think it's more difficult to talk about religion. And I wondered if you could address that.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's so much to be said on that topic. Whatever I say will only respond in a very small way. One of the things that's important, I think, for us to consider, and first of all, in terms of your last point regarding the Nazi period, is Kant's argument that Judaism is not a moral religion, it's heteronomous. Jews just do what they're told. they don't make a moral decision which requires autonomy. And this was picked up throughout the modern period over and over again. The Jews are not moral, they're not ethical and can't be trusted, therefore, and all the consequences of that. But I found it also striking that even among certain feminist thinkers in the post-war era, in the 1980s and 90s, German feminists saying something very similar, Christa Mulak saying, Nazis obeyed the commands of Hitler just like Jews obey the commandments of God. It's the same kind of mentality. This, of course, the search for a Jewish justification for killing Jews. Jews are responsible for their own murder, is one of the strong motifs. Another is the transfer of certain Christian, not only Christian theological claims regarding Judaism, but images. So Hitler was viewed as, in some cases, as Christ and called Christ, is a Christ figure. And in other cases, as the one who will take revenge on the Jews for having killed Christ, but he's doing the work of Christ. So it's a reenactment, the way the blood libel in the Middle Ages was a reenactment of the crucifixion. Now we get our revenge. But revenge is also part of the passion that's going on here. How do we get revenge? How do we get satisfaction? And that I find also in some of the radical movements, including in certain radical Christian, radical Muslim movements, and Islamic radicalism also, a quest for revenge. A revenge for what? For whatever is not satisfying you in your life. And there are many things that I think all of us can name I'm not satisfied about in my life. But the point of it is the combination of the passion and demand for revenge located on the figure of the Jew. The Jew is the reason for the problem, and the Jew is the only way to gain satisfaction as the object that the revenge must strike against. And that the radicalization, the radical movements in certain Islamic circles, not all, of course, that focus on the Jew, are also clearly being manipulated because, of course, one can understand the kinds of conflicts that arise in a period of modernity when you don't have basic healthcare or plumbing or electricity or food for your children and so forth. But the question is, why then do you blame it on the Jews? And that's, of course, a constant that gets transferred from the Tsar saying it's trying to dissuade the peasants from blaming him and blame the Jews, or Adolf Stucker, blame the Jews, don't become a socialist, or radical Muslims blame not the political situation that I'm in and need to change, but rather it's the fault of the Jews or it's the fault of the state of Israel in some way. I mean, this is a far more complex issue, and you've written about it, and I acknowledge that. I'm giving you a very simple half-minute response to it, but I certainly agree with you, and all recommend everybody else. Don't just listen to me now, read Professor Herf's writings about this, and you'll get a more complete response. So thank you.
Thank you for an incredibly powerful lecture. I was really, Sanji Michel. I was very struck by your use of the gender to illuminate various aspects of this, things I hadn't really known about. Even though I'm a women's historian, I didn't know that about these things. And just as the introduction of gender into in many fields of history has illuminated different sides of it, I think it's very clear that the examples you cite have really exposed things that we didn't understand before. And I was thinking about it, and thinking about, well, two things. One is if you could give us some other examples of works that have been used to talk about different periods of anti-Semitism, using gender to kind of rethink some of these incidents. And specifically thinking about the present, I'm wondering, in your discussion of how anti-Semitism is used as a sort of resource that's used to compensate for various perceived hurts or wounds or whatever by contemporary anti-Semites. Two things. One is, I wonder if anti-Semitism is more, if contemporary anti-Semites are more male than female. And second, relatedly, I wonder, I mean, I sort of hate to make this argument or even suggest it, but we could think about it, whether the success of the women's movement has created, the success of the women's movement has created so much resentment among certain groups of men that anti-Semitism becomes one of the tools they use to compensate for it. Of course, I wouldn't want to say the women's movement, feminism should desist. Of course, I wouldn't say that, but just to sort of to unpack what's going on.
Wow, thank you. So this is Professor Sonia Michel. And when I was a student, before I ever met you, I read your work and was thrilled. I remember exactly where I was when I read The Jewish Woman in America. So it's really, I feel honored that you're here and you're asking me this. And you as a scholar of gender have much to say about, in response to your own question. But I do agree with you that gender does illuminate and illuminates many of the elements. I would mention, you asked about pre-modern. Alexandra Kuffel has written a book called Gendering Discussed in Medieval Polemics. And what's interesting about her book is that she reads Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic sources and is able to see how disgust is brought to the forefront, which I think is very important. Again, the emotional valence, the disgust of the other religion, and also how that disgust is gendered, because disgust is often associated with women's bodies in classical religious texts all over, as we know. So turning the other religion into a kind of feminine disgust was one of the strategies. And so her book is great on that. And then I think the question of whether there are more men than women involved in contemporary anti-Semitic movements, neo-Nazi movements, there is something very male about it. I think also about the Ku Klux Klan, and there are studies of women involved in the Klan. You know, the Klan grew suddenly tremendously in numbers and also in regional space in the United States in the 1920s. And they talked about the Klan, about Christ as a Klansman. They had prayers to Christ to open their meetings. The white robe was supposed to symbolize the righteousness of Christ. So the religious is intertwined with the racist and the masculinity of it, the maleness of it. Christ is male, they are Christ, they are male, they are marching, they are doing physical. And what do? They burn a cross. So, yeah. And it's a Christianization. And so what's happening today, I think, is not, in a sense, it's deeply disturbing. I would say not surprising, but it is a revival of something that has been latent in the United States for quite some time. In terms of the success of the women's movement, yeah, I think so. I think actually this horrific attack on a man in his 80s, Paul Pelosi, who had to undergo surgery, and then the mockery, the denial and the mockery, it's terribly disturbing that we have no longer in this country a sense of dignity, a sense of social fabric of what we stand for, what we represent, that at least basically we agree that we have to behave in a dignified fashion. That's gone. What does one appeal to? What do you appeal to at this point? But I would, of course, know that this was an attack directed against his wife, against Nancy Pelosi, and it is interesting to see how many women are targeted. I'm not sure of more women political figures, Hillary Clinton, and I think there have been some others as well who get targeted with these kinds of horrific, but is the success? Yes, one can easily conclude from all of this that white men feel that somehow they're being squeezed, they're not getting their due, that they're not at the top of the heap at this point running the world. I don't think that's true, first of all. It is a perception and it's an ideological one, but what, then it's the fault of women? Then it's the fault of Black people, of Jews? I mean, the logic of it. So it's all ideologically formulated in a way to arouse this kind of rage. And it's horrifying. So what can I say? But yeah.
Hi, we have a question from the online audience. This is from Jay Palmer. Do you have any thoughts to share concerning converts to Judaism and their roles or experiences within episodes of Judeophobia?
What happens to converts in eras of Judeophobia? I don't know if anybody's actually studied it. Certainly conversions to Judaism have been growing in the United States in recent decades. I don't think they've been targeted in a particular way. What is also interesting, though, is what happened to Jews who had been baptized or converted to Christianity and who maybe as children had been going to church every Sunday, and then in September 1941 came to church wearing a yellow star because that's what the Nazi regime mandated. What happens to them? How are they received? I had a professor at Hebrew University who pointed out to me, Professor David Bankier, who said there were complaints from Christians saying, I don't want the Jew kneeling next to me at the communion rail. Now, what does that mean? This is a person who'd been kneeling every single week for decades, lifelong. I don't want the Jew singing in the choir. One woman told a pastor, don't bless my child with the hand that converted a Jew. Now, again, this goes against Christian doctrine of baptism. What transcends the doctrine and renders it meaningless is the disgust. It's the feeling of disgust. I don't want the Jew. I don't want the hand of the pastor to touch my child. That's very striking. And it's striking also how quickly that happened. So quickly. Not that anti-Semitism began in 1933, not at all, but that spread was very quick.
Thank you, Dr. Heschel. I'm wondering if you have a sense whether there is anything sort of a unique flavor to North American anti-Semitism. Is there anything within the American-Canadian context that's a sort of special emphasis that may not be in other places? If there's a distasteful flavor sort of to North American anti-Semitism, do you have any sense of that?
That's really interesting. There's certainly American forms of Protestantism that we don't find elsewhere in the world, and certain Protestant groups that are much larger anyway here. To be honest, I don't have a quick and easy response. A few things come to my mind, but I would want to think about your question a bit more carefully. The setting is different here. And it's also difficult to compare, because if we were to compare to European countries, the situation in Europe today is somewhat different because of the smaller number of Jews than lived in those European countries before World War II. So would I compare the situation today in America with prior to 1933? I could, but then that might be a little distorting. I do think that some of the arguments that one finds in German anti-Semitic literature might not find resonance to an American audience. The Hebrew Bible doesn't have a soul, concept of a soul, so therefore Jews are morally unreliable. I don't think that would play so well in the US. It's a little too theological and heavy for an American audience. But I do think that things associated, Jews associated, anti-Semites pick up on capitalism, for instance, certainly, and on also around the time of the First World War, Lindbergh's movement, the isolationism, the shutting down of immigration to the United States that targeted Jews who were fleeing Hitler. There's so many more elements. It's not exactly contemporary today, but those are certainly, again, political factors. Theologically, today there is a kind of interreligious dialogue effort that's being made that didn't exist prior to World War II in Germany, for instance. I once taught a course and tried to find something positive that German writers had said about Judaism before 1933. I had great difficulty finding anything. Yeah, on the other hand, American Protestants often think of themselves as Jews and occupy that So it's more complicated, but we can talk about it privately if you like.
So I thank you, and I have a few disparate, I guess, questions, remarks. So first, I'm quite happy that you use the word sadism, because I rarely hear that used in the many discussions of either anti-Semitism or racism, and I think it's very important. I guess one question I have is, what role have Jewish studies departments on campuses played in disseminating this important message that you have just presented? A second thing, since we are here, I mean, the Baha'i people have mostly lived in Iran, and they've been treated terribly. And I guess sort of somewhat related to sadism is that many groups teach their followers to look down on whoever the neighbors are. And I think that, that's somewhat connected to sadism, but it's also connected, say maybe to why there's wars all over the place. But there is so I'm sort of curious if you would maybe like compare and contrast the important message that you had with the way the Baha'i are treated in Iran. And I guess sort of relatedly, for this past month, there was the Kurdish woman who was killed by the police for wearing clothing improperly. And there hasn't been much of a response from the West on that. And I sort of think that there's sort of a similar thing of, I mean, I think there's a connection, but I'm actually from the math department, so I don't know about these things. So I'm asking you to elucidate.
Thank you. You actually raised a lot of really important points, and I'm glad you did. And you mentioned, yes, a Kurdish woman. There are many women, a Kurdish woman killed in Iran over her hijab. Where's the National Women's Studies Association issuing a resolution condemning Iran for that? I don't see it. It's not happening. And yet almost every academic organization comes up with either passes or tries to pass a resolution to boycott Israel. The demonization of Israel in the American Academy is one of the many signs that this American venture of universities is in a terrible state of decline. I don't know if we're going to survive much longer. I think American universities suddenly did incredibly well with the refugees who came over from Europe. It was quite extraordinary. Wonderfully trained European scholars came to teach in American universities, and suddenly American universities were great. And now that generation has died, and many of their students have also retired or died. And what do we have? The Jewish studies is a wonderful field. There are outliers, of course, and yet at the same time, I find that there is insufficient attention given to issues of anti-Semitism. I'm not entirely sure if courses are proposed and not approved by committees, or offered and no one signs up, or simply not developed by faculty, but I wish we did have more. There was a possibility of a chair in Holocaust studies at Harvard University about 25 years ago, and it was quashed. And that's tragic. The finalists were exceptional scholars. The field of Holocaust studies is now in bad shape as a result. There aren't that many historians in the field. It's turning more and more to literary studies that are different from being a historian, and that's troubling. Jewish studies as a field has often been isolated from the rest of the university because of its own choice, but I think increasingly because of a marginalization by the rest of the university, not everywhere, but in many places. To be supporter of BDS has become a sign, a boycott of, and divestment, et cetera, of Israel has become a signal to the world of one's so-called political identity, political and cultural and social standing. And that I find, especially among younger scholars, not only, and deeply troubling. I think one of the points about being a scholar is to think in very complex terms and never be reductionist. One is opposed to, obviously, to all kinds of horrors that are taking place in the world, but to reduce concern with the state of the world to one country and blame it is in complete violation of all of the standards of what it means to be an academic and to think in complex ways. So Jewish studies, I think, is a field that is in trouble right now in the sense that I'm not sure we are of the university. I think we've been pushed into a corner very often, and in other cases, we push ourselves into a corner. The idea of thinking critically is fine and important, but sometimes thinking critically can result in blame rather than critical thinking. And that's the problem. So, again, there in most campuses that I'm aware of, an awful lot of campuses I'm aware of, the major political activity on campus is opposition to the state of Israel, with a lot of energy spent on that topic. I don't see much going on anything else, nothing comparable in terms of the amount of energy. So clearly there is a pathology at work. And I find it also deeply troubling because it's preventing us from expressing concern over what is developing in an international scope. My colleagues have not issued a statement about Ukraine. They issued a statement about Israel. Nothing in support of the women in Iran. Nothing in, what can I say? What is that about? No, nothing about Baha'i. Yeah.
We do, yes. This is from Tiffany online. Thank you for a deep and thought-provoking presentation of such a complex and emotional subject. I am wondering if you can say more about the most successful or effective responses to anti-Semitism.
What are the most successful responses to anti-Semitism? I'm not sure anyone has a solution, and that's very disturbing, of course. What is our solution? What do we try to do? We've tried many things. We tried after some of the events of the 1980s with people who were, by the way, called at the time Holocaust deniers, which is, I'll come back to that in a moment. The response was to establish museums, and the one in DC and in many other cities, Holocaust museums that would educate people. And those museums have actually been quite extraordinary. Millions of people visit those museums, and they come out saying, I'm deeply moved by this. This is deeply troubling. The question is to be deeply troubled by what is sometimes called man's inhumanity to man, or to be deeply troubled by the fact that 6 million Jews were murdered. And it's not clear which reaction is being evoked by the visit to the museum. It's also, I would say as a teacher, I don't know really at what age, do I bring 7th graders, 10th graders, college, how to handle it. And even with my students, at the end of the course, I don't want them to just walk away and say, well, those Nazis hated Jews. There has to be something beyond that. What are you now going to do in response to this? How are you going to live your life? What are you going to speak? And teaching people how to speak up. And I think Professor Mahmoudi, when she teaches a course on prejudice, addresses these kinds of issues, and Professor Herf as well. That is, when you hear something, how do you respond? What do you say? Even on the simplest level of a student with a friend in a dorm, how does one respond to that? But beyond that, I think there have been efforts that I thought we're fine. We're going to get rid of anti-Semitism. It's all taken care of. I thought when Elie Wiesel published his work, when it started to be read widely in the 1970s, his book Night, I thought that's it. People are going to understand. That'll be, yeah. and it didn't work. So there is something tenacious about the anti-Semitism, and I'm not quite sure if any single response is the answer. Books, movies, talking to people, each one plays a role. But there is, as I said in my talk, there is some kind of sadistic gratification that people gain from this that needs to be addressed and redirected. And at the same time, we have to see that this is something used on both ends of the political spectrum, left wing, right wing, and those need to be addressed. And then said the falsifiability of it. We need to say to people, how can you believe something that isn't falsifiable? It's like saying, I don't know what, the moon is made of green cheese. How do you falsify certain things? If you can't falsify, then you're not thinking. You're grasping something that is deluding you and misleading you. So perhaps that also, in addition, might be a helpful approach. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Baha'i Chair, this is a small token of appreciation for your amazing scholarship, for your scholarly work, for your lecture. Thank you. We really appreciate your being here. Your thought-provoking lecture will resonate for a while because there was so much richness in that lecture that we need to really reflect on it and think about it. And I think for us to think about, what does this mean for me? What do I do? In what ways can I begin to talk about this important topic in such a way that it impacts on our lives and how we treat others and how we understand others? I think it's extremely important for us to find any way we can to work on eradicating anti-Semitism. And so I really appreciate your scholarly presentation today, which, as I said, leaves a lot for us to go away. And so I've written all these books titles down and have to now start a whole new reading list, which is wonderful. But it's really nice to have you here. Thank you. So I wanted to remind the audience that we have recorded this important lecture. It will be on our YouTube channel. You can access it through the Baha'i Chair website, but you can also find it through the internet. And to thank you all for being here today. I just want to tell you that for this semester, this is our last event, but future events for the following semester are already scheduled and will be posted on our website. So we encourage you to please go to the website, follow us on social media, because we have many more important events that are coming up in the future. Thank you for being here with us today.